In this video, you will be introduced to square roots. So in math, we have all different kinds of operations. We have addition, which is the opposite of subtraction. We have multiplication, which is the opposite of division. And in this case, square roots are the opposite of squares. So basically, square roots undo perfect squares. So let me give you an example here. We've talked about perfect squares before. For example, we have 3 times 3, which is the same as 3 squared. A square root is asking, what do you multiply by itself to get a number? So in this case, 3 squared is 9. So if I were to take the square root of 9, again, that's asking, what do I multiply by itself to get 9? Well, we multiply 3. So the square root of 9 is 3. So when we go into perfect squares, our answers will end up being whole numbers. Now, what I suggest is getting to the point where you're comfortable with perfect squares up to 15 times 15, which is 225. In the meantime, though, I'm going to talk you through a process where if you're not that comfortable with your squares, you can still figure them out. And then I will also show you how to get them on a calculator for the second set of problems where they aren't perfect squares. Okay, so for this first one, if you're not sure, when you look at 64, if you don't know what numbers you multiply together to get themselves, or what number you multiply by itself to get, I would start at the first value that you're familiar with. So let's say you know what 5 times 5 equals. That's 25. Okay, so we're not at 64 yet. So we need to go and check another one. And the reason that this works is because you can use your calculator, right? You can enter 6 times 6. You can see what you get. So notice we're still not there. 7 times 7 is 49. Still not there. 8 times 8 equals 64. So there we go. That's what we need. So the square root of 64 is 8, which again is saying 8 is multiplied by itself to get 64. All right, now looking at the next one, square root of 25, well, notice I already have that right here, right? So that means that the square root of 25 is 5. Okay, so how about 225? Well, that's higher than any of the combinations that I have. And maybe you're familiar with, let's say, 10 times 10. So since we have to keep going higher, if you know a value bigger than 64, right, or a perfect square bigger than 64, I would jump up to that. And then you just have less that you need to do. Now, how about 12 times 12? Because I've got quite a ways to go from 100 to 225. So I don't necessarily have to go, in order. Well, you want to go in order, but you can jump a little bit. Now, a cautionary note on that is when I wasn't feeling very comfortable with my perfect squares, I would sometimes jump right over the number I needed. So if you're really not secure on your perfect squares, I would suggest for now just doing all of them. It certainly doesn't hurt. And again, it's up to 15 times 15 that you really want to be comfortable with. Okay, so we're still not there. So let's do 15 times 15. Okay, so if I do the 15 times 15, I get 225. So that means the answer is 15. So I like to always show, if you don't have a calculator, right, or if you have a calculator, but you don't have a calculator that allows you to do a square root, you can still figure them out when they're perfect squares. And this table that I have, it covers a good portion of the square roots that I suggest knowing. Again, knowing 2 times 2 through 15 times 15, you're going to find that to be pretty good in terms of covering most of the perfect squares that you'll be dealing with, certainly in pre-algebra. Okay, so I'm now going to actually show you how to do each of these, but using the calculator. So on the side here, I have an online version of a TI-84 Plus. So usually if you are in pre-algebra or intro algebra, a scientific calculator is fine. So you'll know that you have a scientific calculator if you have this button, which is like my favorite button ever. It's the exponent button. So it allows you to enter anything and raise it to even a fraction, a decimal, whatever. Now we're not going to use that because that is a root, or well, it's an exponent button, right? And we're doing the opposite of exponents. So that said, whether you're doing a TI-84 or it's actually the TI-30XS, which is a Texas Instruments scientific calculator, the keystrokes will be the same. So here we're doing the square root of 64. Well, notice if I look here, I have a square root symbol up to the left corner. Anything that's in the corners, you have to go to the corresponding colored button, and that's going to give you, in this case, a second function. So we need to do second, this button right here, the x squared button, but because we did second function, it's going to actually use that root symbol. So I click on that. Now, if you don't see the root symbol with something flashing, you'll want to go clear and then try it again. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is just enter the number under the root. And again, we're doing 64. And then we hit enter. So enter on all of the TI-84, TI-83, all of those, they don't have an equals, they use an enter. So just so you're aware of that. That took me a little while to get used to. I was always looking for my equal sign and I never found it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do the next one. So let's see. On these, you actually don't have to clear your first answer, which can be helpful in other scenarios where you can pull down an answer that you had before to the next thing that you need to calculate. So I don't clear between problems, and I suggest that for you too, so you can get used to not erasing stuff so you'll be able to use it in a multi-step problem. So, all right, so here again, square root of 25, so second square root 25, hit enter, and you get 5. All right, so now again, second, my x squared button, right? Because again, I'm trying to pull that square root button down. And then I enter my 225 and I hit enter. So look at that. We got all of those, right? So one was just thinking of pairs and multiplying them together and getting the answer. Here, we actually did a square root of the answer, and then it gave us, what the answer to the root was. So, okay, so now that we've been introduced to how to use the calculator, it doesn't matter whether your roots are perfect or not, right? And basically, a perfect square is where you have a whole number, right, that is being multiplied by itself. So in this case, we have square root of 32. Now, just to be consistent, I always say if you're going to end up with decimal answers, go back to the beginning and see if it was specified where to answer or where to round your decimals, which in this case, it doesn't specify. So I'm going to go ahead and round to the 10th place. I always say don't round to a whole number unless you're specifically asked to. Otherwise, I usually do to the 10th. But if I were grading something and I didn't tell you specifically where, the only rule is to not round to a whole number. Otherwise, I would take whatever you gave me. So, all right, I'm going to follow my process here. So square root of 32. I have my second button, my x squared button. I enter 32 and then enter. And that's a nice long number. So we know because we are going to be rounding, right, that it's no longer an exact answer. And notice I've done a little squiggly equal sign, and that basically says it's approximately the answer that you're putting down. So we got 5. And because I said I'm rounding to the 10th, I'm going to go ahead and round a little bit beyond that, right? So 10th is right here, so that's the number that's going to change. So I get 5 7/10, and that's my final answer. All right, go ahead and pause the video. Go ahead and try C and D. What I would suggest is if you're not comfortable with the keystrokes on the calculator, go ahead and I'll be taking you through those keystrokes again, but actually like write what I say so you have a list. It'll be much easier to remember if you're actually looking at the words and then also watching the keystrokes. So, all right, go ahead and pause the video and try B, C, and D. Okay, so first thing we do, again, we hit second, then we hit the X squared button, and then we enter 74. All right, approximate, we get, I'll just do that. Well, I had said I was going to round to the 10th place, so I'll go ahead and rewrite that and just drop that 0 because we don't need it. Okay, so square root, so second, X squared button, enter your number, which is 116, hit enter. So we have 10 77/100ths, which I'm rounding to 10 8/10. And the last one. So second, X squared, 124, and enter. Approximately, these are all very ugly numbers, but welcome to non-perfect squares. All right, so I'm going to round that, and I get 11 1/10. So make sure that you know how to identify perfect squares without your calculator. So following that first step, create that list just like one should do with your multiplication tables. Go ahead and write a list 2 times 2 all the way to 15 times 15 and calculate out what all of those equal. And that will help you see those pairs. And then make sure that you know your keystrokes for using a calculator, because as you move forward, you're going to encounter fewer and fewer perfect squares. And so you'll be more and more dependent upon using a scientific calculator.